It was supposed to be a smooth flight, just another routine journey connecting bustling New York City to the sun-soaked streets of Miami. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of passengers settling into their seats, adjusting luggage in overhead compartments, and exchanging polite nods with strangers they'd likely never meet again. Among the crowd, a tall, impeccably dressed black man strolled down the aisle, exuding quiet confidence. His tailored suit, polished watch, and calm demeanor suggested a person accustomed to success. Yet, what would unfold over the next hour had little to do with appearances and everything to do with assumptions. This man, let's call him Marcus, was no stranger to flights. As a self-made millionaire and founder of a thriving tech startup, he spent more time in the air than he cared to admit. Today, though, he was looking forward to a rare moment of leisure. A weekend getaway to celebrate his best friend's milestone birthday. He had planned every detail, from the perfect gift to his stay in a luxurious oceanfront suite. The thought brought a small, satisfied smile to his face as he slid into his seat in first class. But not everyone shared Marcus's serene mood. Just a few rows behind him, a flight attendant named Claire was already battling the pressures of a busy day. She was a seasoned professional, someone who prided herself on keeping flights running smoothly. Yet today, a mix of exhaustion and personal stress weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her sharp, no-nonsense attitude often helped her navigate the chaos, but sometimes it bled into how she treated certain passengers. And today, it was Marcus who would bear the brunt of her frustrations. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. As the pre-flight announcements echoed through the cabin, Claire walked the aisle with practiced efficiency, ensuring that seat belts were fastened, seats upright, and tray tables stowed. When she reached Marcus, she paused. Her eyes flicked over him briefly before settling on his carry-on bag, tucked neatly under the seat in front of him. "Sir," she said, her tone clipped, "your bag needs to go in the overhead compartment." Marcus glanced up, puzzled. "It's a personal item. It fits under the seat just fine." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm telling you it needs to be stored overhead." Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension. Marcus maintained his calm, his voice measured. "With all due respect, I've flown countless times with this bag. There's no issue." But Claire wasn't backing down. Her voice grew firmer, loud enough to turn more heads. "Sir, if you can't comply, I'll have to escalate this." Marcus exhaled slowly, not wanting to cause a scene. He stood and moved his bag as instructed, though his eyes met hers with a steady gaze that said more than words ever could. He wasn't angry, at least not yet, but he wasn't intimidated either. Claire, however, seemed to interpret his calm demeanor as defiance, and her irritation simmered just below the surface. As the flight continued, small moments piled up. A delayed drink request, an icy tone when answering his questions, and an unmistakable air of condescension whenever she addressed him. Marcus couldn't ignore the distinct difference in how she treated other passengers, her smiles and polite demeanor disappearing whenever she approached him. Yet he chose to stay quiet, observing more than reacting. What Claire didn't realize, what no one on that flight knew, was that Marcus had a plan. A quiet yet profound way of turning this narrative on its head. And as the plane soared through the clouds, the wheels of a far greater story were set in motion. 5 minutes after one particularly harsh exchange, Claire would do something she'd regret for a long time. And Marcus, he wouldn't have to say much at all. His actions would speak louder than anything, leaving everyone aboard the flight questioning their assumptions and learning a lesson they'd never forget. Stay tuned, because what happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. The plane cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet, but the atmosphere in the cabin felt anything but calm. Marcus leaned back in his seat, looking out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. His expression remained composed, but his mind replayed the events of the past hour. He wasn't one to dwell on negativity. Years of building a business from scratch had taught him the value of keeping his focus forward. Still, the sharp edges of Claire's tone and her constant need to single him out couldn't be ignored. As the beverage cart made its way down the aisle, Marcus decided to test his theory. Perhaps he was imagining things. Maybe Claire wasn't targeting him intentionally. But as she approached his row, her demeanor shifted again. The warm smile she had just given the passenger in front of him vanished, replaced by a perfunctory nod. "What can I get for you?" she asked flatly, her eyes avoiding his. "A sparkling water, please," Marcus replied evenly, his tone betraying none of his thoughts. Claire poured the drink without a word, barely setting it on his tray table before moving on. Her abruptness caught the attention of a middle-aged woman sitting across the aisle. She gave Marcus a sympathetic look, but quickly turned away when she noticed Claire glance back. Marcus sipped his water, his gaze falling to his watch. 5 minutes had passed since the last tense interaction. He could feel the curiosity and judgment of the other passengers. He knew what some of them might be thinking. How could someone so put together, so evidently successful, provoke this kind of treatment? Others might assume he had done something earlier to warrant Claire's hostility. It didn't matter. Marcus was used to being misunderstood, and he'd long since learned how to channel those moments into something greater. Meanwhile, Claire was busy up front, her colleague noticing her unusual tension. "You okay?" her co-worker asked as they prepared the next round of service. "Yeah," Claire replied shortly, though her clipped tone betrayed her frustration. "Just a long day." But the truth ran deeper. Claire's morning had been a whirlwind of personal stress, bills piling up, a heated argument with her partner, and an unrelenting sense that she wasn't where she wanted to be in life. She hadn't realized how much of her frustration she was projecting onto Marcus, at least not consciously. All she saw was a man who looked too comfortable, too self-assured. Something about his calm demeanor irritated her, though she couldn't quite explain why. As she continued her rounds, the plane's intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just received word of some minor turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." The announcement brought a ripple of movement through the cabin. Claire used the opportunity to check in with passengers, ensuring everyone complied. When she reached Marcus again, she paused, as if debating whether to say something. He glanced up, meeting her eyes briefly, but she said nothing and moved on. It wasn't just tension anymore. It was a battle of unspoken words, a clash of perceptions and assumptions. Marcus settled into his seat, fastening his belt as instructed. He thought about the countless flights he had taken in his career, how he'd come to see air travel as a metaphor for life. Smooth takeoffs, turbulent stretches, and moments of clear skies all came together to form a journey. And like in life, the way you navigated those turbulent moments defined who you were. The turbulence was light, barely causing a ripple in the drinks. Yet the unease in the cabin was palpable. Marcus noticed it in the way passengers avoided eye contact with Claire as she passed, how whispers quieted when she walked by. Her earlier outbursts had left an impression, and not just on him. What Marcus found interesting was how quickly people judged situations without knowing the full story. Claire, for instance, had no idea who he was or what he'd been through to get where he was. She saw his tailored suit, his confident demeanor, and likely assumed he had always had it easy. What she didn't know was that Marcus had grown up in a rough neighborhood, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. He knew what it was like to struggle, to be overlooked, to fight for every inch of progress. Those experiences had shaped him, giving him the resilience and humility that guided his success. And Claire? Marcus could see she was struggling with something too. Her frustration wasn't about him, it was about something deeper. He could tell by the way her hands fidgeted when she thought no one was watching or how she avoided eye contact when challenged. But that didn't excuse her behavior. If anything, it made Marcus more determined to show her, and everyone else on that flight, that assumptions could be dangerous things. The minutes ticked by, and the turbulence subsided. The captain announced a smooth landing ahead, and the cabin relaxed. Marcus took out his laptop, typing up notes for a project he was working on. As he typed, a soft ding announced the return of the flight attendants. Claire passed by his row again, her eyes briefly flicking to the screen. She hesitated, as if wanting to say something, but moved on. Marcus smiled faintly to himself. He wasn't one for confrontation, but he wasn't one to let teachable moments slip by either. He could feel the story brewing, the culmination of the day's events nearing. He just needed one more moment, a tipping point, to drive his point home. What would Claire do next? Would she double down on her assumptions, or would she recognize the situation for what it was, a chance to grow, to reflect? Marcus didn't know, but he was ready for either outcome. For now, the tension hung in the air, unresolved and full of potential. Whatever was coming next, it would change the tone of this flight, and perhaps the lives of those involved forever. The plane glided smoothly through the clouds, but for Marcus, the tension inside the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. He closed his laptop, placing it carefully back into his bag, and let his gaze wander across the cabin. The hum of idle chatter had picked up again, and passengers had mostly returned to their books, phones, and half-finished naps. Yet Marcus could feel the occasional glance directed his way, furtive, quick, and filled with curiosity. He wasn't the only one who had noticed Claire's odd behavior. About halfway through the flight, Claire reappeared with another round of service. This time, a colleague, Jessica, joined her in the aisle. Jessica was younger, friendlier, her smile genuine as she handed drinks to passengers and offered extra snacks to restless kids. Marcus observed the contrast between the two flight attendants. Where Jessica seemed to thrive on connecting with passengers, Claire's energy was guarded, her movements mechanical. As Claire neared Marcus's row, a small commotion broke out a few seats ahead. An elderly man was struggling to retrieve his book from where it had slipped under his seat. Jessica was the first to respond, crouching down with a warm smile and retrieving the book with ease. "Here you go, sir," she said, placing it in his hands. The old man beamed at her. "Thank you, dear. That was very kind of you." Marcus watched as Jessica stood, her expression bright despite the hectic pace of the flight. Claire, however, didn't seem to notice the interaction. She moved past the man without so much as a glance, her focus locked on completing her tasks as quickly as possible. Moments later, Claire reached Marcus's seat. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, it seemed like she was about to say something. Instead, she placed a small napkin on his tray and continued down the aisle. The tension that lingered in her brief pause told Marcus she was aware of how things looked. Whether she cared, however, was another question entirely. Marcus picked up the napkin and turned it over in his hands. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting. A word of acknowledgement, an apology, even a stray comment. Instead, he was left with silence. He glanced over his shoulder as Claire moved to the back of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain that separated the galley. It was then that Marcus caught sight of a young girl a few rows behind him. She couldn't have been older than 9, her curly hair bouncing as she leaned into her mother's side. The mother, a woman in her early 30s, was gesturing toward the flight attendants, her voice low but animated. Marcus could only catch snippets of their conversation, but he gathered the mother was trying to flag someone down for assistance. Her daughter seemed to be growing increasingly restless, shifting in her seat and clutching her stomach. Marcus watched as Jessica, not Claire, emerged from the galley to assist. Jessica knelt by the pair's seat, speaking softly to the mother and offering a reassuring smile to the girl. Within moments, she returned with a small packet of ginger cookies and a cup of warm water. The mother nodded gratefully as Jessica returned to her duties, the tension in the row dissipating. The scene lingered in Marcus's mind as the flight carried on. It wasn't just Claire's behavior that stood out now, it was how starkly it contrasted with Jessica's. While Claire seemed to retreat further into her irritation, Jessica stepped up to every challenge with grace and empathy. It made Marcus wonder what had brought each of them to this point, on this flight, on this particular day. As the plane began its descent, Marcus felt the familiar pressure building in his ears. He adjusted his seat and glanced back out the window. The sprawling Miami skyline came into view, a patchwork of glittering skyscrapers and turquoise waters. The sight should have filled him with excitement. After all, this trip was meant to be a break from his usually relentless schedule, yet he couldn't shake the events of the flight from his mind. When the plane landed and taxied to the gate, the usual flurry of movement began. Passengers unbuckled their seat belts, reached for their bags, and prepared to disembark. Marcus remained seated, letting the crowd thin out before standing. As he did, Claire walked briskly down the aisle, her expression as guarded as ever. She barely glanced at Marcus as she passed, but her hurried pace suggested she wanted to avoid any potential confrontation. Marcus reached for his carry-on, the one Claire had made him stow overhead earlier. He could have walked off the plane and left everything as it was, letting the moment pass without another thought. But something inside him told him that wasn't the right choice. There was a lesson here, one that needed to be shared, not just for Claire's sake, but for everyone who had been watching. As he made his way to the exit, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see the young girl from earlier, her mother standing behind her with a small smile. "Thank you," the mother said softly. Marcus tilted his head, confused. For what? The mother gestured toward Jessica, who was now helping an elderly couple retrieve their bags. For staying calm, for showing that it's possible to rise above. Marcus smiled faintly, nodding in understanding. He hadn't said much during the flight, but his presence, and how he handled himself, had spoken volumes. It was a reminder that actions often carried more weight than words. And while he hadn't planned it, his patience had sent a message to more people than he realized. As Marcus stepped off the plane, he felt the weight of the day lift slightly. The story wasn't over, not yet, but he knew the next chapter was his to shape. What came next would be his decision, and he was ready to face it head-on. Marcus walked into the bustling terminal, rolling his carry-on behind him, his mind still replaying the moments on the plane. The flight hadn't gone the way he'd expected, but it had left him with a choice. He could move on, chalking it up to another frustrating travel experience, or he could address what had happened in a way that mattered. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the assumptions people carried, the way they treated others based on appearances or fleeting impressions. As he approached the baggage claim area, Marcus noticed Claire standing to the side near the crew entrance, scrolling through her phone. She looked as tense as she had during the flight, her shoulders stiff, her expression set in stone. Jessica was nowhere in sight, likely already heading home or moving on to her next flight. Marcus hesitated for a moment. Part of him wanted to let it go, to avoid a confrontation that might go nowhere. But another part, the side that had built his life on facing challenges head-on, pushed him forward. He wasn't looking for an argument. What he wanted was clarity, a chance to speak his mind in a way that might make a difference. He approached Claire, his steps measured and deliberate. She noticed him as he drew closer, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though bracing herself for a complaint. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. "Do you have a moment?" Claire glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm off duty now, sir," she replied, her voice clipped. "I understand," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "But I think we should talk, just for a minute." Her posture stiffened, but something in his tone made her pause. She glanced at the bustling terminal, then back at him. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms. "What is it?" Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I couldn't help but notice how the flight went today, and I think you noticed it too." Claire frowned, her defenses going up immediately. "If you have a complaint, you can file it with the airline," she said quickly. "I was just doing my job." "I'm not here to file a complaint," Marcus said, holding up a hand. "I just wanted to have a conversation. Look, I know today probably wasn't easy for you. I've had days like that too, days where everything feels like it's going wrong." Her eyes flickered, a brief crack in her armor, but she quickly recovered. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. I treat all passengers the same. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. Do you really believe that? Claire opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. She looked away, her jaw tightening. The bustling noise at the terminal filled the silence between them, but Marcus didn't press her. He wanted her to think, to reflect, not to feel cornered. You don't know me, Marcus continued after a moment. You don't know where I've been, what I've worked for, or the kind of person I am. But you made assumptions about me anyway, and I'm not the only one who noticed. Claire's head snapped back toward him, her expression shifting from defensive to something closer to surprise. What are you talking about? Marcus gestured vaguely toward the terminal, encompassing the passengers who had disembarked. People see more than you think. They notice how you treated me, and they notice the difference between you and your colleague, Jessica. It's not just about me, it's about the impression you leave on everyone around you. For a moment, Claire said nothing. Her lips parted slightly as though she wanted to argue, but no words came out. Marcus could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged just slightly as his words sank in. Claire's gaze dropped to the floor, her arms uncrossing as she let out a long breath. For the first time since Marcus had approached her, she looked less like a wall of defenses and more like a person struggling with her own emotions. She started, but her voice faltered. She cleared her throat and tried again. I didn't mean to. I didn't realize. Her words trailed off, and she looked at him, her expression a mixture of frustration and regret. Marcus nodded, giving her space to find her words. He wasn't here to humiliate her, only to spark a moment of reflection. Whether she chose to change or not was up to her, but he had planted the seed. Before either of them could say more, a voice came over the intercom, announcing an incoming flight. The sound seemed to jolt Claire back into her professional demeanor. She straightened, her walls going back up, but not as firmly as before. Thank you for saying that, she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the noise of the terminal. I'll think about it. Marcus offered a small, understanding smile. That's all I ask. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing there, her expression unreadable. As he made his way toward the exit, he couldn't help but wonder what she would do with the conversation they'd just had. He didn't expect an immediate transformation. People rarely changed overnight. But he hoped she would take the time to reflect, to consider how her actions affected those around her. As Marcus stepped into the bright Miami sunlight, he felt a sense of closure begin to settle over him. The events of the flight had reached their boiling point, but the resolution was still out of sight, waiting to unfold. Whether it would lead to growth, understanding, or something else entirely was no longer in his hands. All he could do was trust that he had done his part, leaving the rest to time and the choices of those he had encountered. Marcus walked into the terminal's bustling arrivals hall, the Miami heat visible even through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He adjusted his bag and glanced around, his mind still replaying his brief conversation with Claire. It had gone better than expected, though he knew it wasn't guaranteed to change anything. Some lessons took time to sink in, and others never landed at all. Still, he felt he'd done his part. But just as he began to leave the terminal, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The name flashing across the screen stopped him in his tracks. It was an unfamiliar number, but something about it felt urgent. Marcus rarely ignored calls. It was a habit from his years of building his business, where every opportunity had mattered. He answered with a calm, "This is Marcus." The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and slightly frazzled. "Mr. Wright? My name is Jessica Harris. I'm one of the flight attendants from your flight today." Marcus blinked, momentarily thrown. "Jessica, is everything all right?" There was a pause, followed by a slight sigh. "I don't know how to say this, but I overheard something after the flight, something I think you should know." The tone of her voice made Marcus grip his phone tighter. "Go on." Jessica hesitated, as though choosing her words carefully. "After we landed, Claire had a conversation with one of the senior crew members. She mentioned you, and she wasn't exactly kind. Marcus felt his chest tighten. What did she say? Jessica's voice softened, as if she regretted being the bearer of bad news. She claimed you were trying to cause trouble during the flight. She said you were making demands to get special treatment and that you were rude to her. Marcus took a deep breath, the weight of the accusation settling heavily on him. That's not what happened, he said evenly, his mind racing. I know, Jessica replied quickly. I saw everything. That's why I thought you should know. She's trying to file a formal report against you with the airline. Marcus stopped walking, his feet planted firmly in the middle of the bustling terminal. Passers-by brushed past him, but he barely noticed. She's filing a report. For what? She's claiming you were disruptive, Jessica explained. It's not true, and I'll back you up if it comes to that. But I thought you should hear it from me before it escalates. Marcus felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. He'd gone out of his way to remain calm during the flight, even when Claire's behavior had crossed the line. He had tried to address the situation maturely, hoping to leave things on a better note. Now, it seemed his efforts had only sparked something worse. Thank you for telling me, Marcus said after a long pause. I appreciate your honesty. I just thought it was the right thing to do, Jessica replied. For what it's worth, I think you handled everything really well today. Claire, she's going through a lot, but that doesn't excuse her behavior. Marcus nodded, even though she couldn't see him. You're right, it doesn't. But I also don't want this to turn into a bigger mess than it already is. Jessica hesitated again. If you need me to, I can speak to the airline on your behalf. I'll tell them exactly what happened. I hope it doesn't come to that, Marcus said, though he was grateful for her offer. But if it does, I'll be in touch. They ended the call, and Marcus stood in silence for a moment, his thoughts churning. He had dealt with challenges before, far bigger ones than this. But there was something about this situation that felt different. Maybe it was because he had tried to rise above, only to find himself dragged back into the conflict. Or maybe it was because, no matter how far he'd come in life, he still found himself battling the same assumptions, the same biases, the same unfair treatment. As he left the terminal and stepped into the warm Miami air, Marcus felt a new sense of determination settle over him. This wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about standing up for himself and, in doing so, setting an example for anyone else who might face the same kind of treatment. The stakes had changed, and Marcus knew he couldn't let this slide. Whatever was coming next, he was ready for it. Marcus spent the next morning preparing for what he anticipated would be a challenging conversation. After his call with Jessica, he reached out to the airline's customer service to clarify the situation. They assured him that any complaints filed would be reviewed thoroughly and fairly. Marcus, however, knew that fair could sometimes be subjective, depending on who was telling the story. He wanted to be proactive, not reactive. He arrived at the airline's regional office just after noon, having arranged to meet with a representative who could mediate the situation. Dressed in a tailored suit and carrying a calm demeanor, Marcus reminded himself of one thing: he hadn't done anything wrong. Still, the nerves hummed beneath the surface as he checked in at the front desk. Minutes later, he was ushered into a sleek conference room. To his surprise, Jessica was already there, sitting at the far end of the table. She looked relieved when she saw him, offering a small, encouraging smile. Beside her sat a middle-aged woman with a calm but authoritative air. Her name tag identified her as Ms. Alvarez, the airline's customer relations manager. Mr. Wright, thank you for coming, Ms. Alvarez said, standing to greet him. I've reviewed the preliminary reports from both sides, and I wanted to ensure we had an open discussion to resolve this. Marcus nodded as he took his seat. I appreciate that. I want to be as transparent as possible. Before the meeting could fully begin, the door opened again, and Claire stepped in. She hesitated when she saw Marcus, her expression a mix of defiance and discomfort. She took the seat farthest from him, her body language tense. The air in the room shifted, a silent tension settling over everyone. Ms. Alvarez addressed them both. "I've read the statements submitted so far. Mr. Wright, your account aligns with what Ms. Harris has reported. However, Ms. Summers," she glanced briefly at Claire, "suggests there were instances of disruptive behavior." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "With all due respect, I'm curious to know what was considered disruptive, because from my perspective, I was simply trying to address a situation calmly." Claire's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Jessica, sensing the pause, chimed in. "If I may, I'd like to clarify something. I was present during the flight, and at no point did Mr. Wright behave inappropriately or disruptively. In fact, I'd argue he showed a lot of restraint." Ms. Alvarez nodded thoughtfully, her eyes shifting to Claire. "Miss Summers, is there anything you'd like to add or revise?" Claire hesitated, her hands gripping the edges of the table. Her usually sharp demeanor seemed to falter as she glanced at Marcus, then Jessica, and finally back to Ms. Alvarez. "I might have misinterpreted some things," she admitted slowly. "It was a stressful day, and I may have overreacted." The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick. Jessica looked visibly relieved, while Marcus remained composed, though inwardly he felt a small wave of vindication. But just as it seemed the matter was reaching a resolution, Ms. Alvarez leaned back in her chair and fixed Claire with a piercing look. "Miss Summers," she said, her tone firm but not unkind, "this isn't the first time we've had reports of issues with your interactions with passengers. I believe it's time we discuss a different approach moving forward." Claire's face went pale, and for a moment she looked as though she might argue. But then her shoulders slumped, and she gave a small nod. "I understand," she said quietly. Ms. Alvarez turned to Marcus. "Mr. Wright, I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience and discomfort you experienced. I appreciate your patience and professionalism throughout this matter." Marcus nodded, offering a small smile. "Thank you. I'm glad we could address this constructively." As the meeting concluded, Claire quickly excused herself, leaving the room without looking back. Jessica lingered for a moment, walking with Marcus toward the exit. "I'm glad it worked out," she said. "Not everyone would have handled it the way you did." Marcus smiled, a mixture of gratitude and relief. "It's not about winning or losing," he said. "It's about doing the right thing." As he stepped outside, the Miami sun warming his face, Marcus thought the ordeal was finally behind him. But just as he reached his car, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from his social media account, a video tagged with his name. Curious, he opened it, and what he saw stopped him in his tracks. The video showed a passenger from the flight, discreetly filming the interaction between him and Claire. The caption read, "When patience wins. Black entrepreneur handles unjust treatment with class." The clip had already gone viral, with thousands of comments praising Marcus for his composure. What struck him most, though, was the ripple effect it had created. Other people were sharing their own stories of similar experiences, turning the video into a larger conversation about kindness, bias, and accountability. For Marcus, the unexpected twist wasn't the video itself. It was the realization of how far one moment could reach. He had set out to address a personal grievance, but in doing so, he'd sparked something much bigger. As he drove away from the office, he couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, the right actions had a way of speaking louder than words ever could. As Marcus drove away from the airline's office, the weight of the past few days began to lift. The confrontation with Claire, the conversation with Jessica, and the unexpected social media attention had left him emotionally drained, but strangely at peace. He hadn't planned for any of this, yet it felt like everything had unfolded the way it needed to. The viral video was an unexpected twist, but it wasn't the validation he sought. It was a byproduct of doing what felt right. By the time Marcus arrived at his home, the video had amassed even more attention. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers had started reaching out, commending him for his patience and grace. He sat on his couch, scrolling through the comments. Amid the flood of support were a few messages that struck a deeper chord. people sharing how the video inspired them to confront their own biases or stand up in moments when they felt mistreated. It was humbling to see how his experience resonated far beyond the confines of that airplane cabin. One comment in particular caught his eye. It was from someone claiming to know Claire. The message read, "Kai work with Claire, and this really opened my eyes. I never realized how much pressure she was under, but I hope this helps her grow too." It wasn't what Marcus had expected to read, but it reminded him that everyone carried their own burdens, even when they expressed them poorly. Claire's behavior had been wrong, but it came from a place of stress and unresolved issues, something Marcus himself had faced in his earlier years. The next day, Marcus received an email from Ms. Alvarez at the airline. She thanked him again for his professionalism and informed him that the company was using the incident as a teaching moment for their staff. They planned to implement new training programs focusing on empathy and handling difficult situations with passengers. Marcus was impressed. It wasn't just about his experience anymore. It was about creating lasting change within the organization. Later that week, Jessica reached out again. This time, it was a more casual call. She wanted to check in, and Marcus could tell she was relieved the situation had resolved positively. They talked briefly about how the video had gone viral and how people were reacting. Jessica admitted she felt inspired to speak up more often when she saw unfair treatment. "It's easy to stay quiet," she said. "But after seeing how you handled everything, I realized silence doesn't help anyone." Marcus appreciated her honesty. "It's not always easy to step up," he replied, "but sometimes it's necessary." Their conversation ended with mutual respect, and Marcus felt a sense of closure. Jessica's courage in coming forward had been a pivotal moment in the story, and her growth was a reminder that small actions could lead to significant change. As the days turned into weeks, the buzz around the video began to settle, but its impact lingered. Marcus continued to receive messages from people who had seen it, each one a testament to the power of authenticity and resilience. He didn't let the attention change him. Instead, he used it as a reminder of the values that had brought him success: hard work, integrity, and the belief that every person deserved respect. One afternoon, Marcus received a handwritten note in the mail. The envelope was unmarked, but the letter inside was unmistakably from Claire. Her words were short but sincere. "Mr. Wright, I want to apologize for my behavior. Watching the video and hearing feedback from my colleagues has been eye-opening. I didn't handle the situation well, and I'm working on addressing the reasons why. Thank you for your patience and for showing more kindness than I deserved." Marcus stared at the note for a long moment, a wave of emotions washing over him. He hadn't expected to hear from Claire, let alone receive an apology. It wasn't about forgiveness, he had already let go of the anger, but about knowing that his actions had made a difference, even in the smallest way. He placed the note on his desk and smiled. Life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. What had started as a frustrating flight experience had turned into a journey of growth, reflection, and connection, not just for him, but for everyone involved. As he looked out his office window at the city's skyline, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He thought about the lessons he'd learned and the ones he hoped others might take from his story. The world wasn't perfect, but change often began with small, meaningful moments. And sometimes, the most powerful change came from showing patience and grace, even when it was hard. In the end, Marcus realized that life wasn't about the obstacles you faced, but how you responded to them. With the right mindset, every challenge had the potential to become an opportunity for growth, not just for yourself, but for those around you. And that, he thought, was the real win.